Welcome to episode 3 of the Spirit, Mind and Soul podcast. Today I'm speaking with Micheal, who talks about surviving tragedy and how he coped with grief and trauma. Micheal went on to speak publicly and write a book to share his story and message. This was a really heartfelt conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with Micheal and hearing his story, and I hope you do too. Don't forget to subscribe and you'll be notified when the next episode comes out. Hi, Micheal. So, thank you so much for joining me today. I have read your book, and although there's tragedy in there, I think what you're doing, the work that you're doing, and what's come from that, you're doing so much good and helping others. I don't want to give too much away because I want you to tell the story yourself. But yeah, a tragic start. Do you want to take it from there, Micheal, and explain?
Sure, and thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Why?
It's
You're so
awesome to be able to share my story. And I know one of your first questions you ask people is, "What was your life before this incident
yeah,
happened?" I go, "Well, I was in
yeah,
the womb," is what really what happened.
yeah.
I was born July 24th, 1970. On September 19th, 1970, just shy of 8 weeks old, my family and I were hit by a drunk driver. My father was driving us home from Long Island. I was born in New York, and we lived like an hour and a half away from Long Island. My father was driving. My mom was in the front middle seat, and I was next to my mom in the little baby carrier because there were no car seats back in 1970s. And then my brother, who was 3, was sleeping in the back seat. Again, not wearing a seatbelt because it was the 70s. We couldn't find them. They were always stuffed down the cushion or somewhere hiding.
Mm-hmm.
And we were less than a mile away from our house when we were at an intersection, and as our light turned green and my father started to go through the intersection, a drunk driver plowed through the intersection and T-boned the car. The force of the impact was so great it pushed our car into a telephone pole and split the car all the way up to the dashboard. And when the first responders arrived, they just found two mangled metals of mess. And back then they built cars to last, not like today where a shopping cart could cost $10,000 worth of damage, for a little nick. But they built cars back then, and the force was so loud it woke up the neighbors from around the intersection, so they came out to see what happened too. The first responders arrived. They found my father, they found my brother, and they found my mom. They didn't find me for about 10, 15 minutes, and someone found me sandwiched between the door and the dash of the car. As we were taken to the hospital, my brother didn't have a scratch on him, which is a miracle. My dad had to get stitches on his face from the windshield hitting him, on his nose, his forehead, his cheek. My mom was taken into surgery, and as for me, nearly every bone in my body was broken. My skull was completely fractured from one side of my head to the other like a halo, and I was life flighted to another hospital. Uh, my aunt lost count of how many blood transfusions I received to stay alive that day, and and the doctors were telling my dad, "Well, your infant son is touch and go," and my mom was fighting for her life. And unfortunately, my mom, who was only 28 years old, died the morning of the 20th due to her injuries. So, yeah, I mean, I'm a son that my mom. I'm a son that never knew his mom because of a drunk driver. My
Mm-hmm.
brother had 3 years with her. My dad lost his soulmate, that person that he was only married to for about 6 years. And that was taken from us because someone made a wrong decision that day. Um, Despite all my injuries, I grew up to be a competitive swimmer, comedian, college educator, speaker. So I've dedicated my life to sharing my story so other people don't go through the same tragedy. I've been speaking
Mm-hmm.
about this for about 27, 28 years. Um, Last 10, I've been speaking at a local court here in Northeast Ohio to drunk drivers. And last night, I just did a program for about 20 drunk drivers to hopefully inspire them to change their lives. And the program is called The Magical Life. We use humor because I have the maturity level of a 5-year old. So there's humor involved, and so we ease into
Mm-hmm.
it because if it's all doom and gloom or you yell at like a drunk driver,
Yeah.
they're not going to pay any attention. So I think if it comes from the heart and soul,
Mm-hmm.
then you can inspire someone. And I don't want people to feel sorry for me because I was also raised by a woman named Dolly, who's a Jamaican
Yeah.
woman who
We're
you take
going
a
to talk about Dolly.
so
Yeah.
you take a horrible situation, and here was a guardian angel that came in,
Mm-hmm.
but it kind of shows you how our lives could change at someone's bad decision. And
Mm-hmm.
drunk driving is something that is preventable, and it starts
Yeah.
with us and the choices that we make.
Yeah, and really important for people to hear your story and the impact it had on your whole family and your whole life. Um, and you didn't know that it was a drunk driver until you were a teenager or sort of going into teenage
Yeah,
years.
of course I knew my mom was dead because in every school form I had to
Yeah.
write mother's name deceased, and no one ever questioned it. The teachers didn't ask what happened. And as a kid, young child, kid, how do you process that, right? And heck, it was even hard, it's still harder to process it sometime as an adult, as a 52-year-old guy. But
Mm-hmm.
I remember going in my dad's room to get his wallet, and next to his wallet was the press release in his drawers, and that's how I found out I was drunk driving. I always knew it was a car crash, but I'd never
Mm-hmm.
recall until that moment my dad saying it was due to a drunk driver, and not
Mm-hmm.
realizing how much pain my father was in his entire life too.
Yeah.
Grief and tragedy, and as men talking about our emotions.
Because you said he didn't really talk about it, and I think you tried to get him to open up, but I guess it was just too hard for him.
Yeah, you hear a couple stories here and there, but of course you always want to hear more, right? You want to know everything.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one year, 2012, my dad had Parkinson's, but there was one year that he was in the hospital for MRSA and some other stuff, and he wrote me and my brother an email on December 19th, 2012, which would have been my parents' 48th wedding anniversary. And he said even to that day, it was still too hard to talk about, and that was 42 years later. So, yeah, you get older and you realize how much pain he still was in and never got help for that, never pursued it, or maybe he didn't know how because it was a different time
Mm-hmm.
for men, who grew up in that era.
Mm-hmm. But you did. You sought therapy eventually. Do you feel that was a really big part of you moving on or healing?
Healing on, oh yeah, that saved my life. My dad passed away in 2018 in January. My aunt, his sister, passed away 90 days later, and I didn't even start really grieving for my dad, and then you throw my aunt's death on top of it, and I was heading down that dark path again. And depression is like that warm blanket you take right out of that dryer, and it feels really nice, and you don't want to
Mm-hmm.
leave it. And you realize when it's not like I wanted to die; it's just I wanted the pain to stop, and I didn't know how. And I think that's why a lot of people end up taking their lives because they just don't know how to ask for help, or they feel like they're a burden, and there's just no way out. And um, that day that I signed up for counseling, I had lunch with my counselor and another friend of mine. We were trying to put together sort of a comedy show, but a grief thing for men called Staying Up to Grief. We're going to talk about our experiences with grief and do some comedy in it. And at lunch, he goes, "You don't look very well." And you could try to hide your pain, but people that know you very well know the signs. And I signed up online, did the intake form, and I checked off everything was a yes except for "Are you pregnant?" And and that was the start of getting help and counseling because there was a day where I was like, I'm not going to see the end of the week, and I knew that's when I was at the worst because you don't want that pain to continue. And then counseling, yeah, definitely saved my life because I didn't know the tools how to cope with tragedy
Yeah.
and grief for my entire life. I was a swimmer. Swimming helped. I used humor, but when
Yeah.
those fail,
Yeah.
when you lose your sense of humor and like, well, now what? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
I was
dark
going
and
to ask
dangerous.
that because swimming was a big part of your life. So I was going to ask, do you think that was a coping mechanism? Something to focus on and I guess distract, or was it just a love?
Which part? The swimming?
Yeah.
Well, my dad and Dolly tossed us into a pool at a very young age. That's all I really knew how to do. Was swim. So I think as I got older and I got into college and I started to take philosophy courses, and you start thinking all the whys and the what ifs, and you start thinking about life and the anger towards my dad for never talking about it, anger towards God, angry towards Harvey Dennison for killing my mom, and realizing, hey, I'll just be in the pool and you take that out because you're swimming and thinking at the same time. So I think it was more of a coping mechanism. Did I love swimming? Yeah, up to a point. The 5 a.m. practices were getting a bit burdened, but the shaving of the legs wasn't a lot of fun either. But I think it was at that point in time, looking back, it was a coping mechanism for sure.
Yeah. Well, tell us about Dolly. Because when we first spoke, you mentioned Dolly, and I did say I can't wait to hear more about her. And I did obviously you talk about her throughout your book. So can you tell us how Dolly came into your life and how she had a big impact on you?
Yeah, and what's interesting, everyone who reads the book goes, "I want to meet Dolly." She's now, you
I
know,
do.
right, a little bit of a celebrity in that world of my life, and rightly so. And what's interesting is when I started to write the book, she was like, "Don't use my name." I'm like, "Why do I do? Do I still embarrass you?" But my grandmother put an ad in the newspaper for part-time help, and Dolly is from Jamaica, but she was living in England at the time as one of the first policewomen in Scotland Yard, which was very interesting to know that fact later on in my life. And she was visiting her sister in New York. Dolly was there for 3 months, and she saw the ad my grandmother put in the newspaper for part-time help. Figured she'll get a job, as her sister was a nurse. Made the appointment with my grandmother, but didn't show up. She said she couldn't find a ride, and this is where I say fate is very important in everybody's life. A couple of weeks goes by, saw the ad again, called my grandmother, tried to play it off like a first time caller, but my grandmother remembered her accent. And this time she came to the house. When she met me in my crib, she put her fingers into the crib and I latched onto them and I smiled. And she said, "This is where I need to be." She heard about the story of losing my mom. And my grandmother was so desperate, for anyone. And Dolly thought it was going to be temporary, only in the month, only here for 3 months or whatever. And then 3 months turned into 3 years. And when her visa was up, my grandparents sponsored her to stay in the country or kidnapped her. I'm not too sure which one's which. And what was supposed to be a part-time job turned into a lifetime. She raised me and my brother as her own flesh and blood. So I always tell people I'm Jewish Jamaican. I have a white Jewish family and a black Jamaican family, but it's just family. And she taught us about compassion and unconditional love and what the human spirit can do for each other. And I wouldn't be the person I am today if it wasn't for her, because she stepped into that motherhood role, and it wasn't about color or creed or religion. It was just about basic human need. And me, my brother, and my dad, very lucky people that we had her in our life.
And she's still part of your life now.
Oh yeah, she just turned 91 last September, which she would kill me if she hears that live. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, she's gonna
That's
outlive us all.
it's like a blessing amongst a tragedy, I guess.
Hmm.
Lucky that she came into your life, yeah. And obviously you got into comedy was a big part of your life as well then. Do you think that was a coping mechanism as well? Or, was that just, because that ended up becoming a almost career for you?
Oh sure.
Speaking of
Yeah, as a
coping.
kid, I was able to make people laugh. I did magic back then too. My grandfather took me to the magic
Mhm.
store, and it just started. And looking back, you know, and then as time went on, I used humor against bullies, against, in
Mhm.
stressful situations. So without a doubt, humor was a huge defensive coping mechanism with
Mhm.
stress and tragedy and everything. And
Mhm.
still use it to today. And then you realize, as a teenager, hey, I want to be a comedian, as a career. And then you get into it and realize how rough and bad of a career it is. But I love taking material, creating something and then throwing it out there to an audience to see what happens. I mean, the voices in my head thinks it's funny, but will an audience of 100, 200 think it's funny? And when you have that artistic ability, um, and I think relationship with the audience, and they laugh at that.
Yeah.
Look, I've been drunk before. I'm never going to lie about that because I went to college here in the States, so drinking was part of the culture. But alcohol never gave me that high that a joke, for the very first time or the 100th time gets,
Mhm.
that laughter from that audience. And it's like a drug. It really is, because you want more of it. And then you hear the next
Yeah.
laugh, you want more of it.
Yeah.
And, that's why a lot of comedians, end up drinking or on drugs, because they want that high when they're off stage, and just for trying to find that balance. And luckily, I had other avenues. I was raised, a little bit better, I think, in terms of not engaging in the alcohol. But I am against if it harms other people, and of course, the
Yeah.
drunk driving. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. Mhm. So, what does the future hold for you then? Obviously, you're going to continue with your speaking, which is amazing. I think you're doing great work, Michael. Like I say, people can relate to that story, and when they, or not relate, but when they see a human being and what's the impact it's had on them, someone else's actions, and drinking and driving. So, you're going to continue that
I
speaking,
hope
and
so.
you're
Yeah.
trying to take that as far as you can and reach a wider audience.
Yeah, I like to. I mean, COVID kind of hurt a lot of the speakers and trying to get back in the high school area and the colleges. But I also want to shift. I think now that I wrote the book and kind of um, got in touch with those emotions and that grief and coping mechanism as a male, try to help other men through grief and tragedy. So if I could
Yeah.
maybe speak on tragedy and grief from that male's perspective, I think that would be
Hmm.
kind of, I'll say, fun to do, because there'll be humor involved, but just reach the audience, because in our culture, you know, men are supposed to be tough and and stoic and not talk about emotions, but it's so freeing to do, not afraid to do it. And I think when people are depressed, whatever, they think that they're the only ones going through it, and there's safety in numbers. So when they hear about another person who's going through it, they kind of go, "Oh, I don't feel alone," and that would be a good avenue to kind of get into and speak. And I'll also continue to speak at the court, in front of DUI offenders, drunk drivers, as long as they want me to. It's an audience I never thought I would ever speak in front of, but it's been the most rewarding. Here's a
Yeah,
group that I should, be angry at. And hey, I still have anger at times when you read articles about people still doing it, because it's an emotion. I'm never going to lose that. But I'm never angry when I do the program. It comes from what Dolly taught me: unconditional love and compassion, you know, to accept that change. So, if I could squeeze out another book, I could. It took me 20 years to write the first one. So, because I'm a procrastinator and I like naps a lot. So, and I like to dive more into photography. My dad was a photographer. That's how him and my mom met. And if I could do nature photography and wildlife or landscape, maybe do a photography book
hmm
as well, because it's a passion and a good coping mechanism as well, to be out there on a trail,
yeah.
sitting by a waterfall. So there's a couple of things I would like to do.
Are there any practices you do on a daily basis or whenever you feel you need to that help? Obviously, I guess nature then, if you like going out into nature, that must really
Yeah,
help with your process.
nature, hitting snooze like 3 times in a row helps too, for sleep. Exercise definitely helps. If I'm on the bike, like even this morning, I worked out a little bit, because you get those endorphins going, and I think
Yeah.
that creates balance. I live in
Mhm.
Northeast Ohio, so we have some really great parks, and immersing myself in Mother Nature is good. Being with friends, performing, reading, going to a movie. So it's all of those healthy type of things that I like to do as a coping mechanism, and create balance. Because I think when we don't have that balance, and that that dark side is higher, as you know, excuse me, it's hard to regain that without some help and focus.
Yeah. So, is there anything, you've obviously got lots going on, is there anything you're longing for that isn't currently in your life that's just for you?
Um, Paying off my credit cards, does that help? Excuse me. I think, yeah, I mean, personally, a little bit more traveling would do, but I think on the speaking side, reaching more audiences, and
Hmm.
just sharing my story to help other people who, to prevent them from going through what, my family went through. And I
Yeah.
think if you help others, it's pretty powerful. And if you make the world a little bit better, then you're doing something very special. So, it's a little bit of those type things. Travel, see more photography, have that balance, but also inspire people to live, healthy and happy lives, as much as possible. Because I know how blessed I am to be here on a daily basis. Even on the days when you wake up and you just want to pull the sheets over your head, you find that balance and kind of go, I'm pretty lucky to be here, knowing that after 8 weeks that I should have been dead. Doctors had no idea how I survived that car crash, and my mother wouldn't want me to have a bad life. I could have crawled into a bottle my entire life. That's a horrible way to live, but it's not how I was raised. So I'll look at my dad as a
Mm.
role model, and he didn't let Parkinson's get to him so much. I mean, it was still draining, but he still played the piano. I mean, he started a kazoo band. It didn't let you know mentally he was beaten up by the car crash, and then he had this horrible physical disease, but he still played the piano. And I see that as a good role model for myself when I get stuck and kind of go, what am I complaining about? My dad still did this, and I watch him play the piano, and that kind of inspires me then to go do what I have to.
Mhm. So I just wanted to ask as well, and to share, to give others hope as well. Do you feel there's been a significant empowering or magic moment in your life? I mean, it sounds
Um,
like there's been a lot.
yeah, that's a very good question. Probably a lot of parts. I mean, Dolly especially, my friends. So I'll probably say more people than probably events, because it's the people that I've met that kind of keep me inspired and laughing, when I need it the most. My friends from college, family members.
Mhm.
Um, if you're talking about like another events, you know, um, well, speaking every time look, I'm able to speak and share my story. Even last night, it gives me purpose, and that's a good feeling to have. When sometimes you're sitting there going, "What am I doing?" And then you go do this program, and someone says, "Thank you for changing my life." That's always pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Looking back, when my grandfather took me to the magic store, I think that started it all too. That was so pivotal because if I didn't do that, would I be, doing comedy? I was in speech therapy as a kid, so that helped me. And we didn't know if it was just normal childhood pains or it had anything to do with the car crash, and the fractured skull. So that gave me confidence to speak in front of people too. So
Mhm.
that was a huge pivotal part. I think earning a swimming scholarship helped, in terms of putting in hard work and then seeing the reward of it, in terms of all those years of swimming and morning practices. And then also when I had to stop swimming due to injuries, because then you had to discover who else are you. Because up until that time, at 21, 22, all I knew as myself was a swimmer and a student. And you take away one of those things all of a sudden, and then you lose your identity, just like COVID, right? If you
Yeah.
were a server or you worked in a place and it's shut down, one day you're a server, the next day you're not. And then it's like, okay, who are you? So it's going back to those pivotal parts and seeing who I was and then overcoming certain things, and that helped, I think, define who I am today too.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on and sharing that story, and for sharing it with other people, because I think when you're making yourself very vulnerable when you're doing this, and I think that's really, you have to be a very strong person to do that. Thank you for sharing. I really hope that people get value out of this as well and take something from this, from your story. And is there anything you'd like to add, Michael, that you
Well,
didn't
I
speak about?
appreciate it. I would say either strong or just an idiot. I'm not too sure. No, it's fun to do, but I think you're right, and I'll be the last person to say strong because I still think there's places where I can improve, and but
Yeah,
it's
I think
humbling to hear that, and I thank you for that, and it's
yeah,
just
it's okay.
what really allowed me to do it and being vulnerable. I think it frees me from my
That's
depression
yeah.
and those type of things, right?
Yeah, I think you need to be strong to make yourself vulnerable. So I think it's very
Yeah.
brave
Oh, thank you.
of you to do.
Yeah, I think that is because the alternative is not being here. And when I thought I was done for, and what really saved me that day was I couldn't send my brother, Dolly, other family members back to the cemetery 3 times in 6 months. And I thought about the
Mm,
people I would leave behind. And it goes back to friends and family and my supporters and loved ones. Because we all know when someone commits suicide, people say, why didn't they ask for help? And I didn't want them holding that bag and feeling that guilt of what more they could do. And I think when we don't ask for help, it controls us versus the other way around. So I think asking for help and people who are watching or listening, if you're in that darkness, talk to someone. You do have that strength to cope with it. Maybe not always overcome because it may be
mhm,
always there, but I think
mhm.
having the right coping skills will make your life so much better in finding that
Absolutely.
balance.
Yep.
And I thank you for having me on to share my stories so someone out there can find that strength to
Yeah.
ask for help and live a better life.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Michael's story today. I highly recommend reading Michael's book. I will leave details on how to order that in the description box below and details of how to contact Michael if you wish to do so. I'd love it if you could hit that like button if you enjoyed today's podcast and subscribe, and you'll be notified when the next episode comes out.